She was 68 years old. She had just retired. After decades of service to the people of Oklahoma, she was finally free. And on the morning of May 14th, 1976, a neighbor walked up to her front door in Oklahoma City and found something no one should ever find. That is not a story about an elderly woman who lived alone. That is a story about a killer who operated in daylight and vanished for nearly half a century. And it would take 48 years, the Dina of strangers, and a genealogist working quietly in a Florida laboratory to finally give Leila Johnston the justice she always deserved. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back. Because to understand what was taken, you first have to understand who Leila was. Oklahoma City in the mid-1970s moved at a different pace than it does today. The streets in the North Robinson neighborhood were lined with modest duplexes and brick bungalows, the kind built by working families after the war who wanted nothing more than a front porch and a yard. People knew their neighbors. They watched for each other. Station wagons sat in driveways, and in the evenings you could hear the local news broadcast drifting out through screen doors left open in the May heat. There was a familiarity to life on those streets, a sense that the world was knowable, that people were who they appeared to be. Leila Johnston had lived in this world for her entire life. She was the kind of woman who showed up. For years, she had worked for the Oklahoma State Welfare Department, the sort of quiet public service that never makes headlines but keeps a community functional. Sitting across a desk from people in the worst moments of their lives and trying to do something about it. She had retired just a few months before, in the early months of 1976. Her family remembers her as warm and reliable, the kind of grandmother who meant it when she said she was glad to see you. She was 68 years old, recently retired, and living in her duplex in the 3600 block of North Robinson Avenue. She had survived the hard years, the Depression, the war, decades of service, and come out the other side into what should have been the quietest, safest chapter of her life. She checked her locks at night. She knew her neighbors. She was home. That was the last certainty anyone in her family would have for a very long time. The morning of May 14th, 1976, began like most spring mornings in Oklahoma City, warm already before 9, the air carrying the smell of cut grass and red clay. Her neighbor had not heard from her. Something felt wrong in the way small, ordinary things feel wrong before you have words for them. The neighbor went to the door. They knocked. Then they went inside. And what they found in that duplex on North Robinson changed everything that came after. Leila Johnston was dead. She had been beaten. She had been sexually assaulted. And she had been strangled. She was 68 years old, a retired state worker, a grandmother. She had done nothing in this world except serve it, and someone had come through her door and ended her life. Officers from the Oklahoma City Police Department arrived within the hour. By mid-morning, the scene had been processed and evidence collected, physical evidence that investigators at the time hoped would identify whoever had done this. The neighborhood was quiet with the kind of quiet that follows something terrible. People who had heard nothing the night before stood in doorways and tried to understand how something this violent could happen on a street this ordinary. In 1976, technology did not exist. The science that would eventually solve this case had not yet been imagined. What investigators had was physical evidence from the scene, witness interviews, and the tools of their era: photographs, fingerprints, handwritten notes. They worked the case. They knocked on doors. They followed leads. They asked who had been seen near the duplex in the days before. They asked if anyone had noticed a stranger on the block. Sergeant Roy Allred of the Oklahoma City Police Department was among the first investigators assigned to Layla's case. He took it seriously. The evidence from the scene suggested a forced entry. Someone had come through that door with intent. This was not random, but the leads dried up faster than anyone wanted to admit. There were no fingerprints that matched anyone in their files. There were no witnesses who could place a specific person at the duplex that night. The man who had killed Leila Johnston had come and gone, and left behind a case that had nowhere to go. Leila's family was left to wait in the particular silence that follows an unsolved murder, the kind that settles in like weather and doesn't lift. Her daughter, her grandchildren, they had buried her, they had grieved her, and then they sat with the knowledge that the person who had done this was still walking around somewhere, maybe nearby, maybe in Oklahoma City, maybe shopping at the same grocery stores, pumping gas at the same stations, living a life that Leila would never have. That knowledge is its own kind of wound. It doesn't close. The case went cold. By 1980, 4 years had passed. The North Robinson neighborhood had gone on the way neighborhoods do. New families moved in, children grew up, the duplexes changed hands. The investigators who had worked Layla's case had moved on to new cases, not because they had forgotten her, but because the job doesn't stop, and unsolved cases accumulate like sediment. The file was there. The evidence was there. There just wasn't anything new to do with it. By 1990, 14 years had passed. Leila's grandchildren were growing up in a world that didn't know her name. Her daughter carried the case like a stone in a pocket, always there, always heavy, always present, even when no one else was talking about it. They didn't hold press conferences. They didn't organize searches. They simply waited, because waiting was all they had left. The world was changing around them in ways they couldn't have imagined in 1976. Personal computers had arrived. Cable television had changed what the evening news looked like. By 1995, the internet was beginning to make the world smaller in ways that would eventually matter for cases like Leila's. But none of that had reached her file yet. The evidence sat in storage. The case sat open. And the years kept passing. By 2000, 24 years had gone by. Layla's granddaughter, Leslie Sullinger, had grown up knowing that her grandmother's murder had never been solved. She had grown up knowing the name of the wound without knowing the name of the man who had caused it. There are things that stay with a family across generations: rituals, recipes, grudges, grief. Leslie carried the grief of an answer that had never come. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, fact-checking, and rebuilding real lives from public records. If this kind of storytelling matters to you, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now let's get back to Leila Johnston. It was 2004 when something finally shifted. Science had caught up to the evidence. Advances in DNA technology, the same science that had already begun changing how cold cases were handled across the country, meant that investigators could now extract a genetic profile from biological evidence that had been collected nearly 3 decades earlier. The Oklahoma City Police Department's cold case unit went back to the evidence from Layla's case and did exactly that. They built a DNA profile of the man who had been inside that duplex on May 14, 1976. Then, they entered that profile into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the national database that holds the DNA of convicted offenders, evidence from crime scenes, and missing persons. They waited for a match. The match never came. The suspect's DNA was not in CODIS. Whoever he was, He had never submitted a DNA sample as part of a conviction or arrest. The profile sat in the system, accurate and precise, and completely without a name attached to it. The case went cold again, not for lack of evidence, but for lack of a name to attach the evidence to. The DNA knew who this man was. The database just didn't know him yet. More years passed. A decade. Then another. The case unit kept the file active in the way that good investigators keep files, not because they expected a break, but because the alternative is giving up, and giving up is not something you do to a 68-year-old grandmother who never hurt anyone. Then, in the spring of 2023, the Oklahoma City Police Department Cold Case Unit did something that would have seemed like science fiction in 1976. They partnered with DNA Labs International, a private forensic laboratory based in Florida, and a genealogist named Allison Martin Krensky. The technology they were using is called forensic genetic genealogy, and it works like this. Instead of searching a database of convicted offenders for an exact match, you search a database of people who have voluntarily submitted their DNA to ancestry testing sites. Sites like GED Match, where users can opt in to allowing law enforcement to use their data. When you find a partial match, not the suspect himself, but a relative of the suspect, you build a family tree. You work outward from that relative, branch by branch, generation by generation, until you find the person whose DNA matches the evidence exactly. It is painstaking work. It requires a genealogist who is equal parts scientist and detective, comfortable sitting with incomplete information for months at a time, and trusting the branches to eventually lead somewhere. Allison Martin Krensky was that genealogist. In the spring of 2023, working through the genetic profiles in the Ancestry database, she found what she was looking for: a match to a family member of the suspect. Not the suspect himself, someone whose DNA shared enough markers to confirm a biological relationship. She began building the tree. The work took more than a year. Family by family, generation by generation, living relatives and deceased ones, names that appeared in census records and marriage filings and old newspaper archives. The family tree grew. And somewhere inside that tree, always getting closer, was the name of the man who had walked into Layla Johnston's duplex 47 years earlier. The name that eventually emerged was Charles O. Droke. Born in 1948, Charles Droke would have been 28 years old in May of 1976. The genealogical analysis placed him squarely inside the family tree that connected to the DNA found at the crime scene. Investigators didn't stop there. They sought additional confirmation by matching the DNA Droke had left at Layla's home to DNA evidence collected from the investigation into his own death, because Charles Droke was no longer alive. In January of 1989, 13 years after he had killed Layla Johnston, Droke was shot and killed by his younger brother, Edwin, in what Edwin claimed was self-defense. Edwin Droke was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. He died by suicide the day after his sentencing. The confirmation came back positive. The DNA matched. Records show that Droke forced his way into Layla Johnston's residence on the night of May 13th into the early hours of May 14th, 1976. He beat her. He raped her. And then he strangled her to death before leaving the way he had come, into the Oklahoma City night, leaving behind a crime that would go unsolved for longer than most people's working lives. His name had been unknown to investigators for 48 years. He had lived for 13 of those years without ever being connected to what he had done. He had been killed by a family member who didn't know what he had done, tried by a jury who didn't know what he had done, and buried in an unmarked chapter of Oklahoma history that no one had been able to close. until now. On December 5, 2024, the Oklahoma City Police Department's Cold Case Unit held a press briefing. They announced the identification of Charles O. Droke as the man responsible for the rape and murder of Layla Johnston in 1976. It was the first case the Oklahoma City Police Department had ever solved using forensic genetic genealogy. The DNA from two distant relatives, two people who had simply wanted to learn about their family history, who had submitted their saliva to an ancestry website to find out where their grandparents had come from, had, without knowing it, given Layla Johnston's family the one thing they had been waiting 48 years for. A name, a face, an answer. I just couldn't believe it. Johnston's granddaughter Leslie Sullinger said in a video released by the Oklahoma City Police Department. After all these years to finally have an answer. She paused, and then she said the thing that stays with you. I feel an inner peace now. Inner peace. Not justice in the courtroom sense. Charles Droke would never stand before a judge for what he did to Layla Johnston. He had been dead for 35 years by the time his name was attached to the crime. But something had been given back. The not knowing was over. The question that had sat in the middle of Leslie Sullinger's life since she was young had finally been answered. And in a case like this, after this long, that is not nothing. That is everything. There are things the years have a way of burying. Leads, witnesses, evidence, the names of people who deserve to be remembered. But the science that solved Layla Johnston's murder was not available to the investigators who stood in that North Robinson duplex in 1976. It wasn't available in 1990, or even in 2004 when the DNA profile was first entered into CODIS. The technology had to catch up to the truth. And it did. 48 years later, in a Florida laboratory, through a family tree built branch by painstaking branch, it did. Layla Johnston retired from her life of service to the people of Oklahoma in the first months of 1976. She was 68 years old. She had a front porch and a neighborhood she knew, and grandchildren who called her. She had earned everything that came next. What came next was taken from her violently, on a May morning, by a man whose name she never knew, and whose face was never connected to his crime in his own lifetime. She deserved better. Her family deserved better, and the Oklahoma City Police Department's Cold Case Unit, working alongside a genealogist who spent more than a year building a family tree with the patience that justice requires. They made sure the record said so. Her name was Layla Johnston. She was not a victim first. She was a woman who served her community. She was a grandmother. She had a life that mattered to people who loved her. And after 48 years, the silence around her death finally has a name inside it. That matters. However late it comes, it matters. Before we close, a few questions worth sitting with. Do you think forensic genetic genealogy changes our understanding of what cold really means for unsolved cases? What does it say about the relationship between justice and time when an answer arrives 48 years after the crime? And was the resolution enough, not the legal outcome, but the identification alone, to give Layla Johnston's family something they could call peace? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe the truth deserves to be told, no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are in the description. Thank you for watching.